So first of all, my first question goes to you, Mr. Sheldon. The FAA have given very compressed timeline. They're asking the experts, the panel of experts that are tasked with giving out recommendations for the regulation by the end of November the 20th. And the regulations, if implemented, should be in effect by mid-December. Why the hurry, Mr. Sheldon?
Well, the hurry is because we're seeing increased sales of these hobbyist drones, these quadcopters that you could order off a website like Amazon.com, for example. And there is a worry, given the incidences that were mentioned in your reports, the White House lawn incidents, as well as also increasing incidences of these kind of drones operating near commercial airports and the risk of catastrophic collision. And so there is an urge by politicians and senior policymakers to be seen to be doing something about it. The problem we have, though, is that, as in any other public policy area, regardless of the topic, any legislation or regulation that is rushed like this tends to have unforeseen consequences that will become apparent very quickly after they are implemented. And so while the urge is understandable, I'm not sure that the need to get these regulations out as quickly as possible without some form of other review and peer examination and so on to examine the second order and third order effects is warranted.
I would like to turn to our Italy guest there, Mr. Paganini. So our Washington guest there mentioned a little bit about the consequences. So what kind of consequences do you see if the federal government is pushing such regulations in such a short time?
Well, in a short time, I don't see particular dramatic consequence. For sure, there will be a lot of effort from the U.S. authority in order to register all these new devices, these new aircraft, the drones. But anyway, I don't see in medium and long term any kind of impact. It's a natural process. You have to consider that outside there are a lot of actors, street actors that can abuse of this kind of technology. So it's important. It's a first step. It's an important step in order to have a clear idea of which are the number of drones that are in the sky, who is using them, and how is using, which is the main use of these drones. So I don't believe that there will be a great impact in this sense.
Yes, of course, the abused use of these drones should be regulated, but is it really necessary? Mr. Sheldon, these regulations are a huge difference from previous regulations in the U.S. We have never seen, this is an unprecedented federal level regulations. For instance, regarding guns, we don't have a federal regulation. We only have state ones. So do you think this is necessary? Because hobbyists think this is only drone accidents can really be extreme cases, and most of the cases are relatively safe.
Well, exactly, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of second, third order effects. I'm not arguing there should be no form of regulation at all. There probably should be. But the rush to regulation in terms of regulations that may on the surface look like common sense, but in reality in terms of implementing the policy and the regulation, but also enforcing it, that's not entirely clear. And you're right, in a political sense, this is a country, the United States, that from a political, cultural perspective, looks very, very suspiciously at any kind of regulation, regardless of the topic. And this will actually receive a lot of political scrutiny as a result, especially if it's going to be infringing actual civil liberties of individual Americans who use these devices for purely legitimate purposes. And this gets to the point that you raised, which is the vast majority of people who use these devices have no ill intent whatsoever and use them for perfectly legitimate commercial as well as also hobby purposes. The problem you're going to have is the kind of people who will fly a drone deliberately in congested airspace, say around John F. Kennedy Airport in New York City, are not the kind of people who are going to register their drone on some sort of website that would allow the authorities then to track them down and prosecute them. And so the second order and third order of consequences I'm talking about is the kind of people who are going to do bad things with drones, whether they're people who are going to try and cause some sort of problem at airports, or even terrorists who might use it for even worse purposes, are not the people who are going to register the drone and allow the authorities to track them down. Even worse, they might steal the drone from legitimate users and put the legitimate user on the hook for malpractice, even though they themselves weren't necessarily involved or responsible. So these sort of things aren't entirely clear from the deliberations. And to be clear, what we're getting so far from these meetings that have taken place last week in Washington is hearsay. This is nothing official. So I'd be interested to see the actual proper formal details that come out when the FAA is ready. And what's more, the FAA, by the way, are under no obligation to actually implement these recommendations from the committee, though given the political pressure that the FAA are under to do something, I don't see any alternative for them to do so. So what I'm saying here really is that yes, of course regulation is needed, but at the same time, when you rush things like this without the proper deliberation, careful what you wish for. There will be unforeseen consequences that will not necessarily solve the problems we're looking to solve.
Indeed, registration doesn't necessarily mean safety. So, Mr. Paganini, what would be a better way to regulate this? Not just by registration, the owner of the drones.
Well, you are correct.
Was that for me?
Registration doesn't mean that you are securing the environment. It doesn't mean you are securing the city. It's an important step because you have an idea of which are the number of the drones in the sky. But anyway, you have to push the security of these vehicles. You have to apply something like already happened in the military sector, in military industry. We have to protect this drone. We have to improve best practices in the design of these drones. It's quite easy today to hack a commercial drone. It's quite easy today to hijack a commercial drone or jam it in order to cause an incident. So it's important to understand how many drones we are using, who is using this drone and how. This is important also for security experts because they could provide suggestions in order to secure them. I believe that this is just one phase of the overall program that the US government has in mind. Okay, he wants to know the drone, he wants to have a clear idea of the usage in order to provide the best practices in order to secure the usage. Of course, cyber terrorists, cyber criminals, and also other threat actors will continue to use the drones in any way, and regulation cannot solve the problem.
My understanding from our Italian guest there, Mr. Paganini, is that advancing technology and a renovation in technology can also help regulate this industry. So our studio guest here, Mr. Andy Mock, can this be a better way than just registering those owners?
Yeah, well, I think registration is not necessarily a bad idea because, first of all, it allows an assignment of liability. So if there is an accident, not something that is intentional, say a drone crashes and no one knows who it belongs to. So I think there is some rational basis for the FAA's desire to have registration, first of all. But another important question is, where else along the value chain could regulation be implemented? So in the case of the DJI Phantom drone crashing on the White House lawn, what's very interesting about drones is actually it's a hardware product as well as a software product. And DJI was able to send out essentially a software patch very quickly that would prohibit drones from flying over the White House. So it would not be surprising to see regulations develop in that area as well. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that it really is an area of exploration and experimentation, both on the product side as well as on the regulation side.
So how is this, the mandate regulation and mandate registration, going to affect the whole industry? Because in terms of this industry, we have to look at in a longer term. You have to look at the technology innovation in it. We have to look at the commercial, the civil use in it, which is ultimately beneficial to everyone.
Yep, no, and that's a very important point because regulatory uncertainty can inhibit market development. So to the degree that this does cause manufacturers, consumers, and businesses to slow down the adoption of drone technologies, business models, and services, that could put the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage compared to other parts of the world where perhaps regulations are less stringently applied or given more opportunities for the markets to develop.
If approved, what kind of legacy would this UAV incidents leave to those other industries, for instance, automotive mobile? vehicles.
Yeah, well, I think you know, it's a very new industry, so in that way, I don't know what other lessons there might be. I mean, one perhaps is that automobiles, guns are regulated in the U.S. at the state level, whereas drones are regulated by the FAA at the national, federal level. And I wonder if that is perhaps more of just an artifact of historical times, and maybe that could open opportunities for regulation of other products as well.
Open up opportunities for the regulations of other products. So, Mr. Sheldon, do you agree? Should we regulate other products, for instance, automated mobile vehicles?
Well, as your previous commentator just mentioned, that's an open book, because while the automation aspect of these technologies is obviously similar, how those technologies are used are going to be different and context driven. So for example, when you look on the west coast of America, you have companies like Google who are experimenting with automated cars, for example, and all these kind of things. That's going to open up all kinds of different kind of regulatory issues, because you're talking about a much greater possibility of collision with other vehicles as well as with human beings and so on. And while that's certainly a possibility with drones, it's not necessarily one of the first things one thinks about when dealing with drones. You're more interested in things like collisions with aircraft, the ability to prevent those drones from going into certain areas. But you mentioned, and your previous guest quite rightly mentioned, there's other areas where you can regulate or at least put controls on these technologies. And you know, the idea that you could put a software patch into certain drones that will prevent them from flying over the White House. Well, another, of course, method will be also to prevent drones going from beyond a certain altitude, especially around airports. Some form of low-level electronic countermeasure as well that would prevent drones from entering restricted areas or restricted altitudes and so on. And these are the sort of things we're looking at.
Yes,
can I also just be very clear?
Yeah.
I'm not against regulation. What I'm against is rushed, ill-thought-out regulation, even if on the surface of things that we've gathered from last week's meeting, they seem like common sense. They seem like common sense, but we don't know how they're going to be implemented. We don't know how they're going to be enforced, and no one's really spoken about how they're going to deal with the problems that we're really worried about.
Of course, a rush decision is
let's
never
get away from
a
this
good
idea
thing.
that
So
just because it sounds good, we have to do it.
Let's look at it
Yes.
at a global level. Well, UAV regulation has created a lot of controversies around the world. Some countries have taken tougher regulations, for instance, Austria, but others like the UK, Mexico, Brazil, and Australia are embracing these commercial use and civilian use drones. So what kind of lessons can we draw from this? Can we learn from other countries, or each countries have to stick with their own policies? Mr. Paganini.
Well, I consider that we will assist to a natural convergence of the experience of different countries, of different regulation. So what I expect is that in a short period, we will have a shared framework that will consider the aspect of security, privacy, because we have to consider also the importance of privacy today, and also technical issues. So I'm quite confident that we will assist to a convergence, to a shared framework that will be exactly the same in every country.